She stepped down into the mud of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming territory, with $11 sewn into her hem and a trunk of wool ledgers nobody had asked her to bring, sent 3,000 miles to marry a stranger who wanted nothing more from her than a woman who could card wool. He had no notion, that first muddy afternoon in April of 1878, that the ruin of his sheep ranch and the ruin of her family's good name were about to collide into something neither of them could have built alone. Before we ride out to Widow's Fork with her, tell me in the comments what town or city you're watching from tonight. And if you like a slow-built frontier story that earns every mile of its ending, tap like and stay through to the finish, because this one's worth the whole ride. The stagecoach dropped Adelaide Reeve at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming territory, on the 9th of April, 1878, with $11 sewn into her hem, a trunk of Vermont wool sample books nobody had asked her to bring, and a letter that named a man she had never met. Thomas Calloway, $29 a month, a house with a good roof, 4,000 head of sheep that had been closer to 9,000 before the winter took the rest. The agency in Cheyenne had called it a fair match. Addie, 22, had called it a place to go that was not the place she had been asked to leave. She stood in the mud with her trunk and did not cry, because crying was a thing she had done already, in private, on the train, and she did not intend to do it twice for the same reason. He was late. She watched the sun move a full hand's width across the sky before a wagon came down out of the hills, drawn by a mule with one clouded eye, and a man climbed down from it who looked older than $29 a month should have made him. Thomas Calloway had a beard going gray at the corners, though he could not have been past 35, and hands scarred in a dozen small places, and eyes that went over her once, quickly, the way a man checks a horse he has already decided he cannot afford. "You're smaller than I figured," he said, which was not a greeting. "Can you card wool?" "I can," Addie said, which was true, though it was the smallest true thing she owned. He grunted and took her trunk and did not ask what was in it, which she was grateful for, because if he had asked, she would have had to decide, right there in the mud, whether to tell him that her father had run one of the finest merino operations in Rutland County before the scandal, and that she had kept his ledgers from the age of 14, and that she knew wool the way some women knew scripture, by grade and crimp and staple length, by the particular smell of a fleece that had been rained on before shearing versus one that had not. She decided, watching him heave her trunk into the wagon bed like it weighed nothing, that she would keep that to herself a while longer. A woman arrived with less trouble if she arrived as less than she was. The ranch sat 11 miles out along a dry creek called Widow's Fork, in a bowl of land between two ridges that Thomas's father had claimed in 1852 and that Thomas himself had nearly lost twice, once to drought and once, more recently, to the winter of 1876 into 77, a winter old-timers in the territory still spoke of the way people speak of a death in the family. 40 inches of snow in November, no thaw until March. Calloway had gone into that winter with close to 9,000 head, fat and healthy, the largest flock between the Hollow and Fort Steele. He came out of it with just over 4,000, most of them thin as fence rail, and a debt at the Larkspur Bank that had grown teeth. His wife Margaret had died the spring before the winter came, of a fever the doctor in the Hollow never named right, and so Thomas Calloway had gone into the worst winter of his life, already a widower with a boy of 6 to raise, and he had come out the other side of it, a man who did not waste words, because words, in his experience, did not keep sheep alive. The house was better than the letter had promised, and worse than Addie had let herself hope. A good roof, yes. Cedar shake, tight against the weather. But the inside of it had the particular bareness of a house where a woman had died, and no one had known what to do with the space she left. A quilt half-finished on a frame in the corner, gone gray with dust. A shelf of jars in the pantry, half of them still holding preserves put up by hands that were gone now 2 years. A boy, Daniel, 6 years old, thin-faced and watchful, who looked at Addie from the doorway of the kitchen the way a person looks at weather that might turn. "This is Miss Reeve," Thomas told the boy. "She'll keep the house." "Where's Mrs. Calloway?" Daniel asked, meaning the wife who had died, not the one who had just arrived, and Thomas's jaw worked once before he answered. "She's gone, Danny. This is Miss Reeve now." That first night, Addie lay in a narrow room off the kitchen. Not the room Margaret Calloway had shared with Thomas, she noted, and was neither surprised nor wounded by the distinction, and listened to the house settle around her, unfamiliar creaks in unfamiliar wood, and thought about the letter her Aunt Louisa had written her 3 weeks before the wedding arrangement was finalized. "You have disgraced this family enough, Adelaide. Go to the territory and do not write unless it is to say you are married and settled." Her father's name, Josiah Reeve, once the most trusted wool factor in 3 counties, had been dragged through the Rutland papers for a fraud he had not committed, a set of falsified accounts that later, too late to matter, were traced to his own partner, a man named Aldous Fenn, who had by then taken the money and the good name both and vanished toward Canada. Josiah Reeve had died of the shame of it, not the crime, 11 months before Addie boarded the train west. His debts had been called, his house had been sold, and his daughter, who had known the Ledgers better than anyone, who could have testified to their true state had anyone thought to ask a woman such a thing, had been quietly, efficiently disposed of, married off westward before she could become a longer-lasting embarrassment. She had brought the sample books anyway, 11 of them, bound in board and leather, each page holding a swatch of fleece graded by fineness and staple and yield, notes in her father's hand and, in the later years, in her own. She did not know, packing them, whether she was bringing a kind of grief or a kind of weapon. She only knew she was not leaving them behind for Aldous Fenn's ghost to have the last word on what a Reeve knew about wool. The first weeks at Widow's Fork settled into a rhythm dictated entirely by the needs of 4,000 sheep and 1 silent man and 1 wary boy. Addie rose before light to build the fire and have coffee ready by the time Thomas came in from the night check. A lambing shed needed watching even in April, when the last of the ewes were dropping late lambs, and a man who had lost half his flock to weather did not take chances with the half that remained. She cooked what the pantry offered, which was not much: salt pork, dried apples, flour going a little weevily at the bottom of the barrel, a milk cow named Besom, who gave less than she should have, because the hay had run thin before the new grass came in. Addie did not complain about the thinness of the larder. She made note of it, mentally, the way her father had taught her to make note of any shortfall, not as a grievance but as a fact requiring a plan. Daniel warmed to her slower than the weather did. He was a boy who had already learned that people who arrived in his life sometimes did not stay, and he tested her the way children test a new floorboard, with small weight first. He left a dead mouse in her shoe the second week, and when she did not scream, only tipped it out the window and said, mildly, "Was it a good mouse at least, or a poor specimen?" He had looked at her for a long moment before deciding, apparently, that this was an acceptable answer, and had not left her anything worse after that. By the 3rd week he was following her to the hen house to help gather eggs, chattering about a fox he had seen twice near the north fence, and Addie found that she liked the sound of his voice filling up a house that had otherwise been so quiet it rang. Thomas remained harder ground. He spoke to her mostly in the currency of instruction, where the well bucket hung, which of the hands took their dinner at the house and which did not, what days the mail came into the hollow if she wanted to send a letter, though she had no one left to send one to. He ate at the far end of the table from her, out of some instinct she could not name, whether grief or simple habit, and he did not ask her opinion on anything, because he had not hired her, the word he used, once, without apparent unkindness, though it landed on her like a slap, to have opinions. It was the wool that first cracked the distance between them, though neither of them called it that at the time. 3 weeks into her residence at Widow's Fork, Addie walked out past the shearing shed on an errand for eggs, and saw, through the open door, 3 of Thomas's hired hands, and Thomas himself, standing over a spread fleece, with the particular stillness of men looking at a problem they did not have words for. She should have kept walking. She told herself this. Later, more than once, she should have kept walking, minded the eggs, said nothing. Instead, she stopped in the doorway. "That's Kemp," she said. The men turned. Thomas's foreman, a broad, sun-cured man named Ezra Coates, who had worked the ranch since before Thomas was born, looked at her with an expression that was not quite hostile, but was not far from it. "Beg pardon, ma'am?" The coarse fiber, there, mixed through the fleece. She nodded at the spread wool without coming closer, careful not to overstep a boundary she had not yet been told existed. "Kemp, it won't take dye, and it won't spin fine. If your buyer's grading by eye, he'll dock you for it, whether the rest of the clip is good or not, and from here," she allowed herself one step nearer, "the rest of the clip looks like it might be quite good. Merino cross, by the crimp of it." Ezra Coates looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Addie the way he had looked at her in the mud on the day she arrived. Except this time, the arithmetic he was doing was different. "My grandfather ran merino out of a Vermont line," Thomas said slowly, "before he came west and mixed in some Rambouillet for the wool weight. You'd know a merino cross by looking at raw fleece." "I'd know it by looking at raw fleece," Addie said, and did not say anything further, because she had already said more than a woman hired to card wool and keep a widower's house was strictly permitted to say, and she went and got her eggs, and left the men standing in the shed with their coarse kempt fleece and their new arithmetic. That night at supper, Thomas did not eat at the far end of the table. He sat 2 chairs closer, which was not close, but was a distance that meant something, and he said, "Over the salt pork," without looking up from his plate, "Where'd a woman learn to grade fleece by eye?" "My father factored wool in Rutland County, Vermont," Addie said carefully. "I kept his books from the time I was young." "Kept his books," Thomas repeated. "Meaning what?" "Meaning I know what a clip is worth before the buyer tells you what he's decided to pay you for it," Addie said. And something in Thomas Calloway's face moved, not quite a smile, more the loosening of a knot that had been pulled tight a long while, and he said nothing further that night. But the next morning he told Ezra Coates, in Addie's hearing, that Miss Reeve was to look over the spring clip records before they went to the bank, and that was the first door Widow's Fork opened to her, though it would be a long time yet before any of the doors that mattered most came open all the way. The spring unspooled slow and cold, the kind of Wyoming spring that made a mockery of the calendar, snow returning twice in May, the creek running high and brown with runoff, lambing dragging on longer than it should because the weather would not settle. Addie found her feet in the rhythm of it. She learned the names of the hired men: Ezra Coates, foreman, gruff and testing but fair; young Silas Petrie, 17, who blushed when she spoke to him directly, and worked twice as hard afterward to hide it; old Bynum, who had one leg shorter than the other from a horse fall a decade back, and did the ranch's smithing and leatherwork from a stool by the forge. She learned which ewes were troublesome and needed watching at lambing, learned to help pull a breech lamb with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her jaw set, learned that Daniel liked his eggs soft, and hated the particular blue of the good winter coat his mother had knitted him, because it reminded him of a woman he was already starting to forget the shape of, which grieved him more than the memory itself did. She also, quietly, at night, by the light of a single tallow candle she rationed as carefully as flour, went back through Thomas Calloway's account books. He had given her leave to look at the spring clip records, nothing more, but the clip records led naturally to the loan records, and the loan records to the note held by the Larkspur Hollow Bank of Trade, and the note led to a name that made her set the candle down and sit very still in the dark for a long moment. Silas Pruitt, the bank's principal, and she confirmed this 2 pages later, with a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window, the same Silas Pruitt who had, 11 years back, according to a fading letter tucked between 2 ledger pages, extended the note that built the shearing shed, at terms that looked, now that she read them with her father's trained eye, rather than a grieving widower's exhausted one, considerably worse than fair. She said nothing of it yet. She was, after all, still only the woman hired to card wool. Summer came late and hard-won, but it came, and with it the true test of what Addie Reeve had brought to Widow's Fork besides a trunk of sample books. The first of the antagonists arrived not as a person but as a name, spoken by Ezra Coates over breakfast, with the particular flatness men use for bad weather they've seen coming a long while. Pruitt's man was by the north gate yesterday, counting head. Thomas's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Counting for what? Didn't say. Didn't have to. Silas Pruitt himself rode out to Widow's Fork a week later, a soft-handed man in a good coat who did not dismount so much as descend from his horse the way a judge descends from a bench, and shook Thomas's hand with a grip that lingered a half-second too long, the grip of a man reminding another man who held the paper on his life. Thomas Ranch is looking better than I feared, given the winter. His eyes moved to Addie, standing on the porch with a basin of wash-water balanced on her hip, and lingered there too, cataloging her the way he'd cataloged the sheep. "And this'll be the wife the agency sent up. Vermont stock, I hear. Wool people." He said wool people the way another man might say horse thieves, not quite an accusation, but close enough kin to one that Addie felt the hair rise on her arms. "You'll want to keep this year's clip weight up, Thomas. The note comes due in November regardless of what the winter decides to do to you. I'd hate to have to be the one standing at your gate in the spring with a different kind of paper." He said it pleasantly. He said it, Addie thought, watching him from the porch, the way a man says something he has said before, to other ranchers, and enjoyed saying, and Ezra Coates's jaw was tight as wire the whole visit, and after Pruitt rode off down the long dry track toward the hollow, Thomas stood a long moment looking after him before he said, to no one in particular, "Man's held that note 11 years. Never once come out here himself to look at head count. Something's turned." Addie, from the porch, said nothing, though she had a fair idea, from the ledger she'd read 3 weeks before by candlelight, of exactly what might have turned, and exactly how much interest had compounded on a note that should have been near paid off by now if the terms had been what they were represented to be at signing. The second antagonist arrived by post, which was in its own way worse than arriving by horse, because a letter could not be met at the gate and turned away. It came addressed to Miss Adelaide Reeve, care of the Larkspur Hollow Post Office, in a hand Addie recognized before she'd even broken the seal, a hand that made her stomach drop the way ice water dropped down a well. Wendell Marsh, her intended, before the scandal, a bank clerk's son from Rutland who had courted her for 2 years with the tepid confidence of a man who believed the arrangement settled well before either family had settled it, and who had dropped her, by way of his mother's note rather than his own hand, within a week of the fraud charges against Josiah Reeve becoming public. Now he wrote to say he had learned, through channels he did not name, that she had gone west to a marriage of convenience, and that he considered this a misunderstanding requiring correction. "I have reconsidered matters, Adelaide," the letter said, in the particular tone of a man who believed reconsideration on his part was a gift rather than an insult. "Your father's difficulties were not, I have come to understand, entirely of his own making, and I am willing, given time enough for you to extricate yourself from this territorial arrangement, to renew our understanding. I intend to come west in the fall to discuss the matter with you directly." Addie read the letter twice, standing in the dust outside the Larkspur post office with the Wyoming wind pulling at her skirt, and then folded it very small and put it in her pocket, and did not mention it to Thomas that night, or the next, though the not mentioning of it sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. What was there to say? That a man who had abandoned her the week her family fell to ruin now wished to reconsider, now that word had reached Rutland, she was certain this was the shape of it, that the territory marriage had put her, however precariously, back on solid ground, and that a wool ranch of 4,000 head, however indebted, looked better on paper from 3,000 miles away than it did up close. She was not sentimental enough to believe Wendell Marsh's reconsideration was born of love recovered. She recognized calculation when she read it. She had read enough of her father's ledgers to know the shape calculation took, even when it wore the clothing of tenderness. The third antagonist required no letter and no ride from the Hollow, because Mrs. Adeline Briggs, who ran the dry goods store in town and considered the moral condition of every soul within 20 miles her particular province, brought her suspicions directly to church, which was to say, brought them to everyone at once. It was late June, the Sunday service held in the schoolhouse that did double duty for worship, until the Hollow could afford a proper chapel, and Addie had come to town with Thomas and Daniel for the first time since her arrival, wearing her one good dress, hoping only to be unremarkable. Mrs. Briggs had other plans. "Reeve," she said, tasting the name over the social hour coffee, loud enough to carry. "Now where do I know that name from? Reeve. Wasn't there some trouble back east? A wool factor, fraud charges, ruined half a county's investors before he—" She paused for effect. The pause of a woman who knew precisely the weight of what she was about to say and intended to enjoy the dropping of it. "Before he died of the shame of it, I believe I read." "Reeve, Rutland County. That wouldn't be any relation, would it, dear?" The schoolroom went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has decided, simultaneously, to listen without appearing to. Addie set down her coffee cup with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in that room could have known, and said, "My father was Josiah Reeve, yes, of Rutland County. He was cleared of those charges after his death, when the true party was found to have fled to Canada with the missing funds. I don't imagine that correction reached the Rutland papers with quite the enthusiasm the accusation did. It was not entirely true. The correction had reached the papers, but 3 lines on a back page against 3 columns on the front page for the accusation, a discrepancy Addie had noted with the same cold clarity she noted an underweight fleece. Mrs. Briggs's mouth pursed into the shape of a woman who has been denied her scene but has not yet decided to surrender the war, and said only, "Well, I'm sure I hope that's so," in a tone that made plain she intended to keep hoping, publicly, for some while yet, and the whispering that followed Addie out of the schoolhouse that day was quiet, but was not, she noted, nothing. The fourth antagonist she met not through malice directed at her, but through a kind of proud, settled skepticism that took longer to reveal its edges. Cyrus Dunmore ran the largest neighboring spread, 4 sections east along Widow's Fork, and had known Thomas Calloway's father and grandfather both, and considered himself, by right of long acquaintance, entitled to an opinion on anything Thomas did, including the wife he'd sent for. Dunmore rode over in July on the pretext of discussing a shared fence line and stayed long enough to deliver his verdict without quite stating it outright, in the manner of men who prefer their judgments understood rather than spoken. "Eastern women don't generally take to this country," he said to Thomas, though his eyes were on Addie, out in the yard hanging wash, close enough to hear, and, Addie suspected, meant to hear. "Pretty enough, I'll grant, but pretty don't get a lambing shed through a bad march. You'll want to see how she manages before you count on her for much." Thomas's response was a silence Addie could not read from the yard. Not agreement, not defense, simply the silence of a man withholding his hand until he had more cards to play, and Addie, wringing water from a shirt with more force than the shirt required, decided that Cyrus Dunmore's good opinion was a thing she would earn through demonstration rather than argument, because argument, with a man like that, was a door that did not open from her side of it. If the summer brought its antagonists, it brought also, in smaller and quieter measure, its allies. Hetty Vance kept the section adjoining Widow's Fork to the south, a widow of 50-some years who had buried a husband and 2 of 4 children to this country, and had, in the process, made her peace with it in a way that Addie found she wanted to learn. Hetty doctored half the county, set bones, birthed babies, brewed the willow bark tea that broke fevers when the nearest real physician was 2 days' ride at Fort Steele, and she had no patience whatsoever for Adeline Briggs's Sunday theater. "Adeline Briggs," Hetty said to Addie the first time they properly spoke, over a fence line and a basket of the season's first plums, "has made a religion out of other people's ruin because she hasn't got enough of her own life to furnish a full one. Don't you spend a single night's sleep on her, girl. Rutland County's 3,000 miles from here, and getting further every day you stay. It was the first wholly kind thing anyone but Daniel had said to Addie since she'd arrived, and she found, walking back from that fence line with the plums, that she was crying after all. Quietly, the good kind of crying, the kind that empties something out to make room for something else. Ezra Coates, too, warmed by inches through the summer, his testing gruffness softening as he watched Addie work, not flinch from the lambing shed, not complain of the heat or the flies or the long hours, take the ledgers in hand with a competence that plainly startled him more each week. By August he had taken to consulting her, quietly, on matters of the flock's management before he brought them to Thomas, a small but real transfer of trust that Addie recognized for what it was and did not take lightly. "You've got your father's eye for a fleece," he told her once, watching her sort a batch of hand-carded wool by staple length without needing to be shown twice how the grading worked. "Don't know as I've seen a woman do that quicker than most men I've trained to it." It was not effusive praise. In the currency of Ezra Coates, it was practically a psalm. Thomas himself remained the hardest ground, but even hard ground, worked steadily, begins to give. Through the long light evenings of July and August, after Daniel was down and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Thomas had taken to sitting a while at the kitchen table while Addie went over the ranch's books by lamplight, not speaking much, but present, watching her column figures with an attention that was its own kind of conversation. One such night, deep in August, with the crickets loud through the open window and the last of the day's heat still caught in the walls, he said, without preamble, Margaret hated the ledgers, wouldn't touch them, said numbers made her head ache. He was quiet a moment. "You don't seem to mind them much." "I like them," Addie admitted. "A column of figures doesn't lie to you the way people sometimes do. It only ever says what's true." Thomas looked at her then, a long, assessing look that was different from the look he'd given her in the mud on the day she arrived, and said, "That's so," in a voice that carried something underneath it Addie could not yet name, and did not ask him to. But she noticed, after that night, that he began sitting one chair closer still at supper, and that he had started, without remark, bringing her the mail from town himself, rather than leaving it for Ezra Coates to hand along, which meant, she understood with a small cold drop of her stomach, that at some point he was going to see the return address on a letter from Rutland, Vermont, and she would have a great deal of explaining to do that she had not yet worked out how to give. September brought the reckoning Addie had been dreading, though it came in a form she had not quite predicted. Thomas rode into the hollow for supplies and came back with the mail bundled under his arm, as had become his habit, and among the usual, a seed catalogue, a letter from his sister in Cheyenne, a bill from the mercantile, was an envelope addressed to Miss Adelaide Reeve in a hand Thomas did not recognize, postmarked Rutland, Vermont, and he handed it over at the kitchen table without comment, but Addie saw his eyes catch on the postmark before he let it go, and she understood that the question, unasked, was now sitting in the room with them both. She could have opened it later, alone. She chose, instead, in a decision that surprised her even as she made it, to open it at the table, in front of him, and to read it through once in silence, and then to say, "It's from Wendell Marsh. A man I was engaged to before my father's difficulties. He's written twice now to say he's reconsidered our understanding, now that I'm settled here, and that he means to come west in the fall to discuss it." She set the letter down flat on the table between them, an offering rather than a confession. "I didn't tell you sooner because I didn't know what there was to tell. I have no understanding with Wendell Marsh. I haven't answered either letter, and I don't intend to answer this one with anything but a refusal." Thomas was quiet long enough that Addie made herself hold still and not fill the silence with more words, a discipline her father had taught her at a ledger desk and that served her now at a kitchen table. Finally he said, "Your father's difficulties, that the fraud business Ottoline Briggs was so pleased to bring up at church." "Yes, And Marsh dropped you when the charges came, and now wants you back, now that you're out here married. As good as married, he corrected himself, with a small, grim precision Addie noted, to a man with 4,000 head of sheep and a section of land, whatever the note against it. That's the shape of it, yes. Thomas turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, a small mechanical gesture, buying himself a beat of time, the way Addie had learned he did before, saying something that cost him. I'll tell you plain, Addie. I didn't marry you for love, sent for a wife the way I'd send for seed stock, because Danny needed a mother, and I needed hands, and neither of those things waits on a man's grief to finish itself out. But I've watched you 4 months now. You've not once given me cause to think less of you, and I'll be damned. His voice roughened slightly, the closest to raw feeling she'd yet heard from him. If some Rutland bank clerk who let you go the week your family needed him is going to ride out here and tell either one of us how the matter stands. It was, from Thomas Calloway, very nearly a speech. Addie found her eyes stinging and blinked hard against it, because she had promised herself, on the stagecoach in April, that she would not cry twice for the same grief, and this, whatever it was, did not feel like grief at all. It was in that same conversation, riding the loosened current of honesty the letter had opened between them, that Addie told him the rest of it, not merely that her father had factored wool, but the full shape of what she had read in his own ledgers by candlelight 3 months before. Thomas, I have to tell you something about the note Pruitt holds against this ranch, and I should have told you the day I found it, and I didn't, because I wasn't certain yet how you'd take a wife telling you your own business was crooked. She laid it out for him with a factor's daughter's precision. The terms of the note as struck in 1867, compared against the terms as they appeared to be compounding now. A discrepancy in the interest calculation that, if she'd read the figures right, and she was near certain she had, meant the ranch owed Pruitt's bank considerably less than Pruitt's bank was currently claiming. Thomas listened with his jaw set hard enough that a muscle jumped along it, and when she finished he said only, "You're sure of this? I've read 100 notes like it in my father's office. I'm sure enough to want a banker in Cheyenne to check my figures before we take it to Pruitt's face, because a man like that won't be moved by a woman's arithmetic alone, however correct. He'll need to see it confirmed by someone whose opinion he's obliged to respect." Thomas was quiet a long moment, and then he said, low, "Whose opinion he's obliged to respect?" "You mean a man's." "I mean exactly that, and I'm sorry for it. And it doesn't make the arithmetic any less true," Addie said, and Thomas, to her surprise, gave a short, unamused laugh and said, "No, I don't imagine it does." "All right, Addie, write to whoever you need to write to. I'll ride to Cheyenne myself if it comes to that." It was the first time he had used her given name plain, without the miss that had fenced it in since April, and Addie noticed, and did not say she noticed, and carried the small warmth of it with her to bed that night, like a coal banked for morning. The weeks that followed layered escalation on escalation, each antagonist tightening a separate thread of the same net. Pruitt rode out again in early October, this time with a clerk in tow and a face gone harder than his summer courtesies had shown, and delivered his terms without the pleasantries. The note, plus what he termed accrued interest, due in full come the 1st of November, or the bank would exercise its right to foreclose on the north and west sections, which held the best of the summer grazing and the spring nearest the house. "I'd hate to see it come to that, Thomas," Pruitt said, in the same pleasant voice he'd used in June, which by now had curdled, in Addie's hearing, into something closer to a threat dressed as regret. "But a bank's obligations are a bank's obligations. I can't hold paper on sentiment." Addie, standing at the porch rail with her arms folded, said, evenly, "Mr. Pruitt, might I ask when the note was last independently reviewed for its interest calculation? My understanding of notes of that vintage is that a good many banks in the territory compounded at rates the courts have since found irregular." Pruitt's eyes cut to her sharp and cold. "That's banking business, miss. Mrs. Calloway, is it now?" "Not yet," Addie said pleasantly, giving him nothing, "but the arithmetic will be the same either way, Mr. Pruitt, and I do intend to have it looked at." Pruitt said nothing further, but the look he gave her before he rode off carried a weight that told Addie she had made, in that one exchange, an enemy considerably more attentive than the one she'd had that morning. Wendell Marsh arrived not long after, on the 10th of October, having wired ahead from Cheyenne in a message that gave Thomas exactly 4 days to prepare himself for the sight of the man, which Addie thought later was probably a mercy, however unintended. Marsh came dressed for a Rutland parlor rather than a Wyoming ranch yard, in a coat too fine for the dust it immediately gathered, and he looked at Addie with the particular proprietary confusion of a man discovering that a possession he'd set aside had, in the interval, developed opinions of its own. "Adelaide, you look changed." "I've been well, Wendell. Thank you for asking," which you didn't, but I'll answer anyway. He had the grace, at least, to look briefly unsettled by that, before recovering into the tone of a man delivering good news to someone who ought to be grateful for it. "I've spoken with my father. He's willing to overlook the unfortunate business with your family, given time, and I've come to escort you back east, to make the proper arrangements. This," a small gesture at the yard, the sheep pens, Daniel watching from the porch with open suspicion, "this can't be what you intended for your life." "This is exactly what I intend for my life, as it happens," Addie said, and found, saying it, that it was entirely true, more true than any sentence she'd spoken in months. "I'm obliged to you for the trouble of the journey, Wendell, but I have no understanding to renew. I didn't have one to begin with, if we're speaking plainly. You ended what there was the week my father's name went into the papers, and I've built something since then that I don't intend to abandon for a reconsideration that only arrived once the abandoning stopped being convenient to you." Marsh's face went through several expressions in quick succession: offense, calculation, something that might, in a kinder man, have been shame, and settled finally on a stiff, wounded formality. "I see. Well, I hope you won't regret the choice, Adelaide, when the winter comes and this arrangement shows its truer colors." He left within the hour, refusing Thomas's grudging offer of a meal, and Thomas, watching the dust of his departing hired buggy settle back over the track, said only, "Truer colors," in a tone of such flat contempt that Addie nearly laughed, despite the churn still sitting in her stomach from the whole encounter. Adeline Briggs, not to be outdone by bankers or discarded suitors, found her own moment that same month, when the wool the ranch had shorn in the spring came finally to market, and the Hollow's small commercial circle buzzed with the news that Callaway's clip had graded higher, pound for pound, than any flock in 3 counties save Dunmore's own, a fact that Mrs. Briggs, cornered by it, chose to explain not as competence but as suspicious good fortune. "Awfully convenient," she was heard to say at the mercantile counter, "that a woman with a fraud in her family history should turn out to have such a remarkable head for figures. Makes a person wonder what other figures she's turned to her advantage out there." The remark reached Addie, by way of Hetty Vance, delivered with an outrage on Addie's behalf that was, in its own way, a comfort. "I set her straight," Hetty said grimly, "though I don't know that straightening does much good against a woman who's decided which way she means to lean, regardless of the ground under her." Addie, hearing it, felt the old, cold flush of Rutland shame rise in her chest, and then, deliberately, set it down again, the way she had learned to set down a heavy basket rather than carry it further than the task required. Let Adeline Briggs talk. The wool graded high because the wool was good, and the good of the wool did not depend, in the end, on Adeline Briggs's opinion of the woman who had graded it. Cyrus Dunmore's skepticism, by contrast, began to erode under the plain weight of demonstration rather than defense. He rode out again in late October, ostensibly about the fence line, and found Addie in the shearing shed going over the fall wool tallies with Ezra Coates, calling out staple lengths and fineness grades with a speed and certainty that made the old foreman grin despite himself. Dunmore watched a long moment from the doorway before he said gruffly, to no one in particular, Didn't figure a woman for tallying wool that quick. Didn't figure you for a man who judged folks before he'd seen their work, Cyrus, Ezra said, not unkindly. And Dunmore had the grace to look abashed, and said only, before he left, "Well, we'll see how the note business shakes out come November," which was not quite an apology, but was, from Cyrus Dunmore, a considerable retreat from where his opinion had stood in July. The last week of October brought the crisis to its narrowest point, all three threats converging almost on top of one another, the way storm fronts sometimes stack over the hollow until the sky goes the color of an old bruise. Thomas had ridden to Cheyenne, as promised, carrying Addie's figures. 3 nights of careful work by lamplight, every column checked twice, every discrepancy in Pruitt's compounding laid out in her own clean hand alongside her father's original notation on notes of similar vintage, to a banker named Harlan Voss, whom Thomas's late father had known and trusted, a man with no particular loyalty to Silas Pruitt and a professional interest. Addie had gambled in seeing an irregular note exposed before it set precedent for others like it in the territory. She had spent those 3 nights alone at Widow's Fork with Daniel and the Hands, the house feeling larger and colder than it had any right to with just the one man gone from it. And she found herself, on the second night, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark shape of the shearing shed against the stars, thinking not about Pruitt or Marsh or Adeline Briggs, but about her father's face, the last time she'd seen him. Gray and stooped, and already, she understood now, half given up on living, and she thought, "I will not let this family be ruined twice by other men's arithmetic." It was as close to a vow as she had made since arriving in the territory, and she said it to the dark kitchen window with a fierceness that startled her. Thomas returned on the last day of October, a day early. His horse lathered from a hard ride, and he came into the kitchen with a paper in his hand and an expression Addie could not immediately read, until he set the paper on the table and she saw Harlan Voss's signature at the bottom of a formal notice of irregularity, addressed to the Territorial Banking Commission, laying out in a Cheyenne banker's careful legal language exactly what Addie had found by candlelight in August. That the note held by the Larkspur Hollow Bank of Trust against the Callaway Ranch had been compounding at a rate 11% above what the original 1867 terms specified. An error. Voss's letter used the word error, though everyone in the room understood it was a choice rather than an accident, that had, over 11 years, inflated the outstanding balance by a sum considerably larger than the ranch's entire annual wool receipts. Voss says, Thomas told her, his voice not quite steady, that with this filed, Pruitt's got 2 choices. Correct the note to its true balance, which is near paid off already by his own bank's original terms, or answer to the Commission for Irregular Lending, which Voss tells me has cost at least one banker in Cheyenne his charter these past few years, once the territory got serious about cleaning up note fraud. He looked at her a long moment. "You did this. Sitting at my kitchen table with a candle, you did this." "We did this," Addie said. "You rode 200 miles on my say-so, which took its own kind of nerve." And Thomas, uncharacteristically, crossed the kitchen and took her hand in both of his, work-roughened and warm, and said nothing further, because there was nothing further, in that moment, that needed saying. Silas Pruitt did not surrender easily, and the last days before the note's stated deadline saw him try one final maneuver, riding out not to Widow's Fork this time, but into the hollow itself, to call in a favor from Wendell Marsh, who had lingered in town longer than his wounded pride should have permitted, apparently unwilling to return east and report failure to his father without one further attempt at leverage. The 2 men, Addie learned later from Hetty Vance, who had it from the barkeep at the Hollow's one saloon, had put their heads together over the notion that a public airing of the Reeve fraud scandal, timed to land in the territorial papers just before the commission reviewed Pruitt's note, might taint Addie's credibility enough to cast doubt on the very figures that were about to unmake Pruitt's position. It was a petty scheme, born of 2 petty desperations meeting at the right low moment, and it might even have worked. Had either man understood the ground they were standing on well enough to know that Hetty Vance heard everything eventually, and that Hetty Vance did not keep such things to herself when a friend's good name was the target. "They mean to run something in the Cheyenne paper," Hetty told Addie, arriving at Widow's Fork at a near gallop 2 days before the commission's review was due, "dressing up your father's old scandal as though it were fresh news, time to land right when that commission's looking at Pruitt's note. I don't know as it'll work, but I know as it's meant to hurt you regardless of whether it works, and I thought you'd want the warning rather than the surprise." Addie sat with this a long moment at the kitchen table, Thomas beside her, Daniel doing sums at the other end with the particular showy concentration of a child pretending not to listen to grown talk. And then she said, slowly, an idea assembling itself even as she spoke it aloud, "Then we don't let them land it as news. We get ahead of it. I'll write the truth of my father's case myself, plainly, with the Rutland correction attached, and Voss's letter about Pruitt's note beside it, and we take both to the hollow paper before Pruitt or Marsh can take their version to Cheyenne. Let the hollow read the whole shape of it at once," my father cleared, Pruitt's note irregular, rather than a partial ugly rumor with no context to weigh it against. Thomas looked at her with something that had, by now, stopped pretending to be merely respect. "That's a bold thing to hand a small-town press, Addie. Once it's printed, you can't call it back." "I know it," Addie said. "I'm tired of other people deciding what gets said about my family while I stay quiet and hope the saying stops on its own. It doesn't stop on its own. I've learned that much this year, if I've learned nothing else." The Hollow Sentinel, a 4-page weekly run by a taciturn printer named Obadiah Kress, who cared considerably more for a good story than for the comfort of any given subject of it, ran Addie's account in full on the last Thursday of the month, under a headline of his own devising, "Rutland Wool Factor Cleared. Local bank note found in error." That put both matters before the whole of Larkspur Hollow in a single sitting, 3 days ahead of the Territorial Commission's scheduled review, and, not incidentally, 2 days ahead of whatever version Pruitt and Marsh had been quietly assembling for the Cheyenne press. It was, Addie reflected afterward, the first time in the whole long, unhappy business of her family's ruin that she had gotten to choose the words rather than merely survive someone else's. The town's reaction was not universal grace. Ottoline Briggs, cornered by the news at the Mercantile, managed only a stiff, "Well, I suppose that does put a different color on things," which was as near an apology as her nature permitted. But it shifted, decisively and publicly, the weight of suspicion that had hung over Addie since June, and it left Silas Pruitt, arriving in the Hollow 3 days later, to face the Territorial Commission's inquiry, walking into a room already primed against him, rather than a room he could still hope to sway. The Commission's review, held in a back room of the Larkspur Hollow Courthouse on the 3rd of November, was not the dramatic reckoning Addie had half expected after all the build-up of the preceding weeks. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of quiet, paper-bound resolution her father's ledgers had always taught her to expect from institutions when the numbers were finally laid bare before them. 2 commissioners from Cheyenne, a stack of documents, Harlan Voss's formal letter, Addie's own reconstructed figures, and Silas Pruitt, sitting very straight in a hard chair, with his soft hands folded, and his face gone the particular gray of a man watching a comfortable arrangement collapse in real time. The senior commissioner, a dry, precise man named Aldrich, went through the note's compounding schedule against its original 1867 terms for the better part of an hour, and at the end of it said, without any theater at all, "Mr. Pruitt, this note is corrected as of today's date to reflect its true balance under original terms, which by my figuring stands at $412, not the $2,900 you presented to Mr. Calloway as due. Furthermore, given the pattern this suggests may exist in your bank's other lending, this office will be requesting a fuller audit of your notebook within the month." Pruitt said nothing for a long moment, and then, in a voice gone thin, said only, "Understood," and that was the whole of it. No gavel, no crowd, no speech, only a corrected sum on a page and a bank whose principal would spend the coming winter, Addie suspected, considerably less comfortably than he had spent the last several. Thomas paid the corrected balance in full that same afternoon, from the fall wool receipts that Addie's careful grading had helped secure at a better price than the ranch had managed in years, and walked out of the Larkspur Hollow Bank of Trust a man who owed no one anything for the first time since his father's death, and stood a moment on the boardwalk in the cold November light with an expression Addie had not yet seen on him. Not relief exactly, or not only relief, but something like a held breath finally let go after 11 years of not knowing it was being held. $412, he said, half to himself. All these years, thinking I was drowning under a debt that was near paid off since 1874, if the truth had been told plain. He looked at Addie a long moment on that boardwalk, in front of the bank, in front of whoever in the hollow cared to see it, and said, I don't know how to thank a person for handing them their whole life back, Addie. I don't know as thanks is even the right shape for it. You don't need the right shape, Addie said. You rode 200 miles on my say-so, and you didn't once ask me to prove myself smaller than I was to make the asking easier on you. That's thanks enough, if you want to know the truth of it. Wendell Marsh had already quit the hollow by then, on the morning stage east. His scheme with Pruitt collapsed alongside Pruitt's note, and he sent no further letters after that. And Addie found she did not think of him again with anything stronger than a distant, faintly pitying recollection, the way one recalls a cold one has fully recovered from. Winter came on properly after that, but it came on a ranch settled rather than a ranch under siege, and Addie spent the long dark months of December and January doing what she had wanted, in some unspoken way, to do since the night she first read Thomas's ledgers by candlelight. Building, rather than merely defending. She proposed it to Thomas on a night in early December, the two of them sitting close at the kitchen table now as a matter of habit, rather than exception, Daniel long asleep, the fire banked low. I want to put in a proper flock register, Thomas. Breeding records, kept the way my father kept his best merino lines, sire and dam, fineness of fleece, staple length, yield at shearing, year over year. We could breed toward finer wool deliberately, instead of hoping the crosses come out right by accident. It's slower than just running more head, but it's the difference, in the long run, between a ranch that survives a bad winter and a ranch that only ever recovers from one. Thomas listened to the whole of it, turning his coffee cup its habitual quarter turn, and said, You're talking about changing how this ranch has run since my grandfather's day. I am. Good, Thomas said, and that was the whole of his blessing, and it was, from a man of his temperament, entirely sufficient. The flock register grew, through that winter and the 2 winters following, into something considerably larger than either of them had first imagined. Addie's breeding records, cross-referenced against her father's old Vermont notation system, allowed Widow's Fork to identify, within 3 seasons, a line of ewes whose fleece graded finer and heavier than anything the ranch had produced before, and word of the improved clip spread through the county the way such news does among ranchers who watch each other's fortunes as closely as their own weather. By the 3rd year, Addie found herself fielding requests from neighboring outfits. Cyrus Dunmore among the first, and in its way the most telling, riding out in the spring of 1881, not to deliver a verdict this time, but to ask one, hat literally in hand at the kitchen door. I'll own it plain, Mrs. Calloway, he said. She had been Mrs. Calloway a year and a half by then, the wedding held simple and quiet in the Hollow schoolhouse the December after the note was settled, Hetty Vance standing up beside her in place of the family 3,000 miles gone. I was wrong about you in July of '78, and wrong twice over by October, and I'd take it as a kindness if you'd look over my own breeding stock and tell me plain where I'm going wrong, because my clip hasn't graded worth a damn in 3 years, and yours keeps climbing. Addie did look, and did tell him plain, and Cyrus Dunmore's flock improved enough over the following 2 seasons that he became, of all unlikely outcomes, one of the staunchest defenders of Addie Calloway's good name in the whole of Larkspur Hollow, a conversion Hetty Vance found so richly comic she brought it up, laughing for years afterward. It was Hetty, in fact, who planted the seed of the project that would come, in time, to matter more to Addie than the ranch's improved fortunes, even as those fortunes made the project possible. Half the women in this county, Hetty said one afternoon in the spring of 1882, the 2 of them shelling peas on the Widow's Fork porch while a warm wind moved through new grass, can't read a note well enough to know when a banker's lying to them, and can't grade a fleece well enough to know when a buyer's cheating them, and haven't got a soul to teach them different, because their men either don't know either or don't think it's a wife's business to know. You taught yourself out of your father's ledgers, Addie. Seems to me there's no reason that teaching has to stop with you. The idea sat and grew through that year and the next, taking on shape slowly the way the flock register had. First, an informal gathering of 4 or 5 ranch wives at Addie's kitchen table on slow winter Sundays, working through basic bookkeeping and wool grading together over coffee. Then, as word spread and the numbers grew past what any kitchen could comfortably hold, a proper building, raised in the spring of 1885 on a corner of Widow's Fork land that Thomas donated outright, with lumber and labor contributed by half the ranches in the county, Cyrus Dunmore's hands among the loudest in hammering the frame together. They called it, in the end, at Daniel's suggestion, he was 13 by then, and had grown from the wary, watchful boy of 1878 into a sharp, affectionate young man who trailed Addie through the woolshed as eagerly as he'd once trailed his father. The Reeve Calloway Hall, half schoolroom, half lending library, holding not only Addie's own 11 Vermont sample books, restored now to a use she had never quite dared imagine for them on the day she packed them into her trunk, but a growing shelf of agricultural texts, ledger primers, and a slate board where Addie taught wool grading to anyone, woman or man, who cared to learn it properly rather than by guesswork and hope. The years between the note's settlement and the ranch's true flourishing were not without their smaller trials, the ordinary weather of a life rather than the crisis weather of its first difficult season. And Addie found these years, in their way, dearer to her than the dramatic ones, because they were the years in which she and Thomas built something between them that no longer required explaining or defending, only tending. The winter of 1879 brought a diphtheria scare through the hollow that took 2 children from the Petrie family down the valley and left Daniel feverish for 3 terrible days. And it was Hetty Vance's willow bark and Addie's steady, unrelenting nursing, 3 nights without proper sleep, cold cloths and broth spooned patiently past a child's swollen throat, that saw him through it. And Thomas, watching his son's fever finally break on the 4th morning, had gone out to the barn and wept where he thought no one could see him, and Addie, following to bring him in for the first sound sleep he'd had in days, had simply put her arms around him from behind and said nothing at all, because some griefs and some reliefs alike did not want words laid over them. The spring of 1880 brought a second lambing season managed almost entirely on Addie's own direction. Thomas laid up 3 weeks with a broken leg from a fall chasing a strayed ram down a rocky wash, and it was in that spring, watching her run the whole operation, hands, breeding schedule, the difficult decisions about which ewes to cull and which to carry through another season, with a competence that no longer surprised anyone at Widow's Fork, though it had once astonished the whole county, that Ezra Coates finally said aloud what had been settling in him for 2 years. "I'll tell you something, Mrs. Calloway, and I don't say it easy, being a man who came up thinking a ranch wanted a man's hand at its center regardless of what stood behind him. I'd take your say over near any ranchers in this county now, present company included, and I've told Thomas so to his face, which he took better than I expected, being as it's his own wife I was comparing favorably to him." Addie had laughed at that, genuinely, the first real laugh Ezra Coates had drawn from her, and said, "Tell him I said the 2 of you make a fine matched pair of stubborn old fools, then since we're being plain with each other. and Ezra had laughed too, and something in the easy, unguarded shape of that laughter told Addie, more than any grand declaration could have, how far the ground beneath her at Widow's Fork had shifted since the mud of April 1878. A daughter was born to Thomas and Addie in the autumn of 1881, named Margaret Louisa, Margaret for the wife who had come before and whose memory Addie had never asked Thomas to set aside, only to make room alongside, and Louisa for the aunt who had sent Addie west in disgrace, and who received, 3 years after the fact, a short, dignified letter from her niece informing her that the marriage had proved a happy one, the ranch prosperous, and the family's name, so far as the territory of Wyoming was concerned, entirely restored, a letter to which Louisa Reeve never replied, though Addie had not, in truth, written it expecting a reply, only to close a door with her own hand rather than leave it hanging open on someone else's silence. Margaret Louisa grew into a quick, dark-eyed girl who took to the ledgers even younger than her mother had, sitting at Addie's elbow from the age of 5, demanding to be shown how the columns worked, and Daniel, 8 years her elder, doted on her with the fierce, slightly showy affection of an older brother who had spent his own early years starved for the softness a sibling brings into a house. The Reeve Callaway Hall, once built, took on its own life faster than either Addie or Hetty had quite anticipated. By 1887, it held regular Tuesday sessions on bookkeeping that drew wives from ranches a full day's ride distant. Women who came to learn not merely wool grading, but the plainer, harder-won skill of reading a note or a contract with a clear enough eye to know when a husband's or a banker's arithmetic didn't square with the truth of it, a skill Addie taught, always, with the story of Silas Pruitt's note as its central lesson, told not as gossip but as instruction. This is what an irregular compounding schedule looks like on paper. This is how you catch it. This is what it cost one family 11 years to discover and one winter of careful reading to correct. Adeline Briggs, in one of the stranger turns the intervening years produced, became in her own grudging fashion one of the hall's most faithful attendees, arriving each Tuesday with her account books from the dry goods store and a stiff, unapologized-for silence about the church gossip of 1878 that Addie chose, deliberately, not to disturb. Some reconciliations, she had come to understand, arrived more honestly through shared ordinary labor than through any spoken forgiveness, and Adeline Briggs, learning to grade a fleece and balance a ledger at Addie Callaway's own table was, in its unspoken way, apology enough. The wool itself, meanwhile, had become the pride not merely of Widow's Fork, but of the whole Larkspur Hollow district. The Callaway breeding lines, Addie's careful cross of the old Vermont Merino stock with the hardier Rambouillet crosses Thomas's grandfather had first brought west, recognized by 1888 as producing some of the finest, heaviest yielding clip in the territory, sought after by buyers as far as Denver, and twice now by an agent representing an eastern mill that Addie noted, with a small private irony she shared only with Thomas, was headquartered not 30 miles from the ruins of her father's old Rutland operation. "There's a fitting shape to that if you squint at it right," Thomas said, reading the buyer's letter over her shoulder. "Your father's old territory, buying wool graded by his daughter's own system, 3,000 miles, and 10 years removed from the scandal that was supposed to end the Reeve name in wool. There's a fitting shape to a great many things, if you wait long enough to see how they finish," Addie said, and folded the letter away to answer in the morning. The confirmation of all this, the moment the whole of Larkspur Hollow came to see plainly and all at once what Addie Callaway had built, arrived not through any single dramatic event, but through the district's autumn wool fair of 1889, an occasion the county had held in some modest form since before Thomas's father's day, but which had never, until that year, drawn buyers and ranchers from as far afield as it did once word spread that the Callaway Clip and the Reeve Callaway Hall's teaching had together lifted the whole district's wool quality to a standard worth traveling for. The fair was held in the Hollow's newly built Grange warehouse, the largest structure the town had yet raised, its rafters strung with the season's best fleeces for judging, the floor crowded with ranchers and their wives, buyers down from Cheyenne and Denver both. And, in the audience that day, seated near the front by design rather than accident, Addie having quietly arranged it with the fair's organizing committee, Silas Pruitt, whose bank had survived its audit only by the narrowest of margins, and who had spent the intervening 8 years running a considerably more modest and considerably more honest operation, chastened enough by the commission's scrutiny that he had, in a final irony neither Addie nor Thomas had engineered but both privately savored, become one of the district's more scrupulous lenders, a man who now checked his own compounding schedules twice before he'd let a clerk send a note out the door. The judging that year gave the district's grand prize for finest clip to the Callaway flock for the third consecutive season. But it was not the ribbon itself that made the day what it became in the county's memory afterward. It was the moment, midway through the afternoon, when the fair's organizing committee, at Cyrus Dunmore's own insistence, delivered as a proposal to the assembled ranchers with the particular gruff formality of a man righting a wrong he'd once been slow to see, called Addie Callaway up before the whole gathered crowd to accept, on behalf of the Reeve Callaway Hall, a formal commendation from the Territorial Agricultural Society for advancing wool quality and financial literacy across the district. The first such commendation the Society had ever awarded to an institution founded and run by a woman. Addie stood before that crowded warehouse floor, Thomas beside her, Daniel 11 then, and grinning openly, Margaret Louisa 8, and solemn with the importance of the occasion, Ezra Coates and Hetty Vance, and even, at the edges of the crowd, a stiffly attentive Adeline Briggs, and she thought, in the brief silence before she spoke, of the mud at the edge of Larkspur Hollow 11 years before, of the trunk of sample books nobody had asked her to bring, of a man who had wanted only to know if she could card wool. "I came to this country 11 years ago," she said, when she spoke, "expected, I think, to be a quiet kind of help around a house that had lost its warmth. I didn't come expecting anyone to ask what I knew, only what I could carry and cook and mend. I'm grateful, more than I can rightly say, to the man who turned out to want more from a partner than that, and to this district, which turned out, in the end, to judge a person by the work of her hands and the clarity of her figures, rather than by whatever old trouble followed her out from the place she started. I'd only say this, to any woman standing in the mud the way I once did, wondering whether what she knows will ever be asked for, bring your books. Bring whatever it is you know, however unlikely anyone thinks it is to matter out here. This country has room, in the end, for more than anyone expects it to hold." The warehouse, packed to its rafters with people who had watched the whole of that 11-year arc unfold in the particular close, half-gossiping, half-caring way of small communities, gave her an ovation that Daniel would describe for years afterward as the loudest sound he'd ever heard indoors, and Silas Pruitt, seated near the front, was seen, Hetty Vance reported this with considerable relish for the rest of her life, to clap along with everyone else, whatever private reckoning sat behind his eyes as he did it. It was on the ride home from that fair, the wagon moving slow through the blue autumn evening with Daniel and Margaret Louisa both asleep against Addie's shoulder, that Thomas reached over and took her hand the way he had that November afternoon outside the bank, and said, quietly, under the sound of the wheels on the dry track, "You know I never once regretted sending for you, even in that first month when I couldn't have told you why. There was something in the way you looked at that fleece in the shearing shed doorway, before you'd said 10 words to me plain, that told me the agency had sent me something they didn't know the value of themselves." "They sent you a woman who could card wool," Addie said, smiling into the dusk. "That's what the letter said you asked for." "The letter didn't know what it was asking for," Thomas said. "I didn't either, if I'm honest. Took me the better part of a year to understand what I'd actually been sent." "And what was that?" Addie asked, though she thought she already knew the shape of his answer. "A partner," Thomas said, "not a wife to card wool. A partner, in the whole of it, the ranch, the raising of my children, the plain business of getting through the years. I don't know as I'd have said that word to you in April of '78. I'm saying it now. The years after the Wool Fair of 1889 unspooled the way a life well and steadily built tends to unspool once its hardest arguments have been settled. Not without grief, because no life of any real length is without grief, but without the particular gnawing precariousness that had marked Addie's first 18 months at Widow's Fork. Daniel Calloway grew into a tall, capable young man who left for 2 years' study at the Agricultural College in Fort Collins in 1893. At 19, over his father's initial and quickly abandoned reluctance, Thomas had wanted him home working the flock, but Addie had argued, successfully, that a ranch built on careful breeding and careful figures only grew stronger for having a son who understood the science of both from more than an apprentice's angle. And Daniel returned in 1895 with a diploma, a young wife named Louisa Fenwick, whom he'd met at an agricultural society dance, and a head full of new ideas about scientific breeding that he laid, respectfully but persistently, alongside his mother's own methods, the two of them arguing happily over fleece samples at the kitchen table, the way Addie had once argued silently, alone, over her father's old ledgers. Margaret Louisa Calloway, for her part, showed from girlhood a gift not for wool, but for the Hall's other half of its mission, the plain teaching of ledgers and letters, and by 1898, at 17, she had taken over the greater part of the Reeve Calloway Hall's Tuesday instruction from her mother, a passing of responsibility that Addie found, watching her daughter explain a compounding schedule to a room of ranch wives with the same patient clarity Addie herself had once learned from her own father, more moving than she had words to properly express. "You've got Grandfather Reeves' way of laying a column out so a body can't help but see the truth of it," Addie told her once, watching from the back of the hall as Margaret Louisa worked through a lesson, and her daughter, pleased and a little embarrassed by the comparison, said only, "I never met him, Mama. I only ever had you to learn it from," which struck Addie, hearing it, as perhaps the truest measure of what she had managed to carry forward out of her father's ruin and into a daughter who had never once had to know shame for the name Reeve, only pride in what that name, refiled at Widow's Fork, had come to mean. Ezra Coates worked the ranch until his own final illness took him gently, in his sleep, in the winter of 1896, having trained up 2 full generations of hands under his exacting eye, the last of them a young man named Tobias Ruiz, whom Ezra had, in his final working years, come to treat with something close to the same gruff respect he had once, so reluctantly, extended to Addie herself in the shearing shed doorway of 1878. Thomas and Addie buried him on a rise overlooking Widow's Fork's north pasture, beside the grave of Thomas's father, and some years later, near enough to Margaret Calloway's own resting place that Addie had come over the years to think of that quiet rise as the ranch's truest ledger, recording in stone what the account books recorded in figures, the plain, accumulating history of what a life spent at this work could add up to. Hetty Vance lived on past the turn of the century, doctoring the district well into her 70s, with a stubbornness that outlasted 3 younger physicians who tried, unsuccessfully, to convince her the Hollow no longer needed a country healer now that a proper doctor had settled in town. She and Addie remained close the whole of their lives. The friendship that had begun over a fence line and a basket of plums in the summer of 1878, deepening, over the decades, into something closer to sisterhood than neighborliness, and it was Hetty, more than anyone save Thomas himself, who Addie credited in later years with having taught her that a person could belong somewhere not by erasing what she had been before, but by letting the place see the whole of it, trouble and competence both, and choosing to stay regardless of which parts the place chose to gossip about. Cyrus Dunmore's reconciliation, begun so gruffly at the Widow's Fork kitchen door in 1881, deepened over the following 2 decades into a genuine and lasting friendship between his family and the Calloways, his own daughters among the most regular attendees at the Reeve Calloway Hall by the middle of the 1890s, and Dunmore himself, in a final gesture that struck the whole district as almost comically thorough given his early skepticism, served 3 terms as the Hall's board treasurer in the years after Addie stepped back from its daily running, keeping its accounts, he liked to say, with the same careful eye Addie Calloway had once taught half the county's wives to bring to their own kitchen tables. It was not, in the end, an unblemished redemption. Dunmore never fully apologized in so many words for the judgment he'd passed on Addie before he'd known her, and Addie never demanded that he should, understanding by then that some men's amends arrive more honestly through decades of changed behavior than through any single speech, and she had learned, from her father's own hard example, not to require of a reconciliation more perfection than life actually offers. Adeline Briggs, too, softened by degrees too gradual to mark by any single date, though Addie noted, looking back from the vantage of 1900, that the woman who had once tried to shame her before the whole of the Hollows Sunday congregation had become, by the century's turn, one of the Reeve Calloway Hall's most reliable Tuesday attendees, and, in a turn Hetty Vance never tired of retelling with relish, the person who taught the Hall's newest arrivals their letters when Margaret Louisa was too occupied with the ledger classes to manage both. Whether this constituted forgiveness or merely the long erosion of old grudges by shared, ordinary work, Addie never fully decided, and came, in time, to think the distinction mattered less than she'd once believed it did. Adeline Briggs showed up, Tuesday after Tuesday, year after year, and did useful work alongside women she had once tried to turn against Addie's name, and that showing up, sustained across 2 decades, was its own kind of answer to the question of whether people could truly change. Silas Pruitt's fall from the district's confident, comfortable banker of 1878 to the chastened, careful lender of his later years was never fully repaired in the eyes of the wider county, and he died in 1897 still carrying, Addie suspected, more private shame over the note's exposure than he ever spoke aloud to anyone, his bank having survived the audit but never again holding the unquestioned local authority it once had. Addie felt, hearing the news of his death, not triumph, but a complicated, weathered kind of pity. The same pity, she thought, that she had once wished someone had extended to her own father in his last gray months, when the whole of Rutland County had been so much quicker to condemn him than to check the arithmetic that might have cleared him sooner. She said as much to Thomas the evening the news reached Widow's Fork, and Thomas, who had less patience for Pruitt's memory than his wife did, said only, "Man had every chance to correct his own books honestly, long before you ever forced the matter. I'll grant your pity, Addie, because it's a kinder thing than the man deserved, but I won't pretend I share the whole measure of it myself," which struck Addie as an honest enough accounting of the difference between her own hard-won mercy and her husband's plainer, less complicated sense of justice, and she did not ask him to feel it any more than he did. By the turn of the century, Widow's Fork had grown from the 4,000 thin, weather-battered head Thomas Calloway had nursed through the winter of 1876 into a flock numbering close to 11,000 across 3 linked ranges. The largest and finest graded operation between the Hollow and Fort Steele, its Vermont Cross Merino line sought by buyers as far as Boston, and the Calloway name, once attached in Thomas's own mind mostly to grief and near ruin, had become, across the whole of the territory that would soon enough become the state of Wyoming, a byword for the particular combination of careful science and hard-won trust that Addie had built into every corner of the operation, from the flock register in the barn office to the ledger primers on the hall's back shelf. Thomas himself, 61 in the year 1900, and gone entirely gray now rather than merely gray at the temples, had slowed his own daily work on the ranch, content to leave the greater share of its running to Daniel and to Addie both, and spent his later afternoons most often on the porch of the house he and Addie had, over 2 decades, rebuilt and expanded twice over, watching the light move across the ridges the way he had watched it, Addie liked to say, since long before she'd ever arrived to share the watching with him. It was on one such afternoon, in the late summer of 1901, with Daniel's own 2 young children, Thomas's first grandchildren, a boy named Josiah after Addie's father, and a girl named Hetty after the friend who had done so much to see the family through its hardest years, playing in the yard below the porch, that Addie found herself, unprompted, turning over the whole shape of the 23 years since the stagecoach had dropped her in the mud at the edge of Larkspur Hollow. She had brought, on that first day, 11 sample books nobody had asked her to bring, and a competence she had been taught, by every circumstance of her life to that point, to hide rather than offer. She thought now, watching her grandchildren chase a half-grown lamb across grass her own careful breeding had helped make possible, of how easily that competence might have stayed hidden, how easily she might have arrived, married quietly, kept the small house, carded the wool exactly as asked, and let the rest of what she knew die quietly with her, the way it had so nearly died with her father, unacknowledged, unused, ruled irrelevant by men who had never once thought to ask a woman what she understood about a column of figures. "You've gone quiet," Thomas said, from his chair beside her, watching the same yard, the same grandchildren, the same lamb making its slow, undignified escape toward the fence line. "Thinking on something?" "Thinking on the mud," Addie said, "the day I got here. Thinking how close I came to keeping the whole of what I knew folded up small enough that nobody would ever have had cause to ask me for it." "You never were much good at keeping things folded small," Thomas said, with the particular dry fondness of a man who has spent 23 years learning to love exactly that quality in his wife. "Tried it myself the first month, thinking you'd settle into whatever quiet corner of the house a man was supposed to keep a hired wife in. Didn't take, if you recall." "It didn't take," Addie agreed, "and I've never once been sorry for it, whatever it cost either of us those first hard seasons." Below them, Josiah, 4 years old, solemn-faced in the particular way of a child who has already, somehow, absorbed some early sense of the weight his name was meant to carry, abandoned the chase after the lamb and climbed instead into his grandmother's lap on the porch, demanding, as he did most afternoons, that she tell him again about the wool books, the ones in the glass case at the hall, the ones that had crossed the whole country in a trunk before he was ever born. "Tell you what, Josiah," Addie said, settling him against her, the same afternoon light that had watched her arrive as a stranger in 1878, now falling gold and long across a porch that had become, in every way that mattered, entirely her own. There were 11 of them, bound in leather, and my own father filled the first pages of most of them before I was near old enough to hold a pen steady myself. He taught me to read a fleece by its crimp and its staple before he ever taught me my letters proper. I sometimes think, though your great-grandmother would tell you different if she were here to argue the matter. And when everything else my father built got taken from him, his good name, his business, the whole of what people believed about him, those books were the one thing nobody thought worth stealing, because nobody but the two of us ever understood what they were actually worth. I carried them 3,000 miles in a trunk nobody asked me to bring, to a man who only wanted a wife who could card wool, and it took the better part of a year before anyone here understood I'd carried something considerably more useful than that. Josiah, 4 years old and already sleepy against her shoulder in the late gold light, asked, as he always did at this point in the telling, "And now everybody knows." "Now everybody knows," Addie confirmed, and found, saying it, that the sentence carried a satisfaction that had taken her the whole of 23 years to earn, and that she did not, even now, take entirely for granted. The Reeve Callaway Hall, by 1901, had grown into an institution the district could no longer easily imagine itself without, its Tuesday ledger classes and its wool grading instruction having, over 2 decades, quietly reshaped the financial competence of nearly every ranch family within a day's ride of Larkspur Hollow. Its lending shelves grown from Addie's original 11 Vermont sample books into a small but genuine library of agricultural and financial texts that Margaret Louisa, 20 years old now and married herself to a young schoolteacher named Amos Kirby, ran with a steady, generous authority that had, by every account, entirely surpassed her mother's own early efforts, a fact Addie noted with more pride than any wistfulness for her own diminished role in the hall's daily operation. "It was never meant to be mine forever," Addie told Hetty Vance. the two of them sharing coffee on the Widow's Fork porch one autumn afternoon, watching Margaret Louisa's buggy disappear down the track toward town, loaded with new primers for the coming winter's classes. It was only ever meant to be a door somebody held open long enough for the next person to walk through and hold it open further than I ever managed myself. That's most of what any of us manage, in the end, Hetty said, if we manage anything worth the managing at all. And the two women sat a while longer in the particular comfortable silence of a friendship that no longer required much filling with words. Thomas Calloway died in the winter of 1909, quietly, in his sleep, in the same bed he and Addie had shared for 30 years, and Addie, 60 then and gone entirely silver at the Temples herself, found that the grief of it, though real and deep, carried none of the raw, unmoored quality she had witnessed in him over the memory of his first wife in those early strained months of 1878. Theirs had been, by every measure either of them had ever cared to apply, a marriage built plank by plank out of demonstrated trust rather than declared passion, which had made it, in the end, no less fully a love than any of the more dramatic kind, only a slower and more thoroughly tested one. She buried him on the rise, overlooking the north pasture, beside his father and his first wife and Ezra Coates, and stood a long while afterward looking out over land that had been, on the day she arrived, a battered and half-broken thing, and was now, by every account the territory kept, one of the finest and most carefully managed sheep operations north of Denver, its flock numbering past 12,000 head. Its breeding lines sought by buyers from 3 states, its name, Calloway, and increasingly, in the district's own easy shorthand, Reeve Calloway both, spoken with nothing but respect from Fort Steele to Cheyenne. Daniel took over the full running of the ranch after his father's death, with Addie remaining, by his own insistence and her own considerable pleasure in the arrangement, as the flock register's senior authority and the hall's honorary founder, a role that kept her useful and occupied well past the age when most women of her generation had long since retired to a rocking chair and a shawl. She lived to see Wyoming itself change around her, statehood achieved in 1890, the railroad reaching near enough to the Hollow by 1903 to cut the old 3-day wagon journey to Cheyenne down to a single afternoon, the century's turn bringing motor cars and telephones into a territory that had, on the day she arrived, still measured its distances and its news by the speed of a horse. She adapted to each change with the same steady, unhurried practicality she had brought to every crisis of her younger years, though she confessed to Hetty Vance, in the last years of the old healer's own long life, a certain fondness for the slower country she had first arrived in, a fondness she was careful never to let curdle into the kind of backward-looking bitterness that mistakes its own youth for the whole of what was good in a place. Margaret Louisa's daughter, Addie's granddaughter, named Adelaide in her turn, though the family called her Della to spare confusion between the generations, grew up entirely inside the world her grandmother had built, rather than fought her way into it, learning to grade a fleece and balance a column of figures from the time she was old enough to hold a pencil steady, with none of the early doubt or concealment that had shadowed Addie's own girlhood education in her father's Rutland office. Della Kirby would go on, in the century's second decade, to be among the first women in the district to sit on the Larkspur Hollow Agricultural Cooperative's governing board, a position that would have been unthinkable, Addie reflected, watching her granddaughter's confirmation hearing from the same Grange warehouse that had hosted the Wool Fair of 1889, in the Larkspur Hollow of 1878, when a woman's competence with figures had been, at best, a private oddity to be hidden rather than a public qualification to be celebrated. "You built the ground she's standing on," Hetty Vance told Addie, watching Della field questions from the cooperative's board with the same unhurried clarity Addie herself had once brought to a notes compounding schedule. "Every bit of it, going back to a candle and a stack of borrowed ledgers. I only ever meant to keep my own family from being ruined twice by other people's arithmetic," Addie said. "The rest of it grew up around that, mostly on its own, the way a garden grows past whatever fence you first put up to keep the deer out." Mostly on its own, Hetty repeated, with the particular dry affection of a lifelong friend who had watched every deliberate, unglamorous hour of labor that had actually gone into that growing. Is a modest way to describe 20 years of Tuesday classes, girl, but I'll let you keep your modesty if it suits you better than the truth of the matter. Addie Reeve Calloway lived to see the year 1912, dying in her sleep in the spring of that year at the age of 56, in the same house she had arrived at as a stranger 34 years before, surrounded in her final months by 3 generations of a family that had grown, root and branch, out of the single stubborn refusal she had made on a muddy April afternoon in 1878 not to let herself be smaller than what she actually knew. The Hollow Sentinel, still run by then by Obadiah Cress's son, who had inherited both the paper and his father's taste for a properly told story, ran her obituary across the whole of its front page, under a headline that Daniel, reading it aloud at her memorial service in the Reeve Calloway Hall itself, found he could not finish without his voice breaking, "She came to Cardwool and built an empire of it." The hall itself, by then serving its 4th decade of continuous operation, closed its doors for a single day in her honor, the only closure in its entire history, before reopening the following Tuesday with Della Kirby at the front of the room, teaching a new class of ranch wives to read a compounding schedule the way her grandmother had first taught the skill to a roomful of skeptical, curious women 30 years before. There was, in the last year of her life, one final afternoon that the family would return to often in the retelling, sitting as it did so close to the end and carrying, in its plain, unremarkable shape, the whole of what the preceding 34 years had actually amounted to. It was late in the autumn of 1911, the wool already shorn and graded and sold at the season's best price in a decade, and Addie had asked Daniel to drive her out, one last time before the weather turned hard, to the rise overlooking the north pasture where Thomas lay buried beside his father and his first wife, and Ezra Coates, the ranch's whole accumulated history gathered under the same quiet grass. She stood there a long while in the thin gold light, leaning on Daniel's arm, looking not at the graves themselves, but out past them, over the pasture where the season's lambs were still grazing before the first snow would move them down to the winter fields, and out further still to the low roof line of the Reeve Calloway Hall, visible from that rise as a small dark shape against the paler grass, its windows, even at that distance, showing the lamp Margaret Louisa lit each evening for the Tuesday class that never once, in 30 years, failed to meet. "I used to think," Addie said, to Daniel, though she might as easily have been saying it to the grass and the sheep and the whole wide bowl of land itself, "that I'd come out here to survive a shame that wasn't rightly mine to carry, and make a small, quiet life of it, and be grateful if nobody ever asked me for more than what I could hide behind a wash basin and a wooden spoon. I didn't come out here meaning to build any of this. I only meant to keep one family, your father's and then ours together, from being ruined the way mine was, by men who never once thought to check their own arithmetic before they let it ruin a life." She looked out at the hall's lit window a long moment. "The rest of it, Daniel, the hall, your sister's classes, Della sitting on the cooperative board same as any man in this county, the rest of it just grew, the way wool grows on a good sheep in a good season, if you tend the ground right, and don't cut corners on the breeding. I didn't plan the whole of it, I only ever refused, that first spring, to make myself smaller than what I actually knew, and I kept refusing, one season at a time, until there wasn't any smallness left worth pretending to." Daniel said nothing for a long moment, watching the same lamplit window, the same low autumn light moving gold across grass his own mother's breeding had made finer than any in 3 counties. And then he said quietly, "It's not a small thing you built, Mama, whatever you meant by it at the start," and Addie, leaning on her son's arm in the thinning light of a Wyoming autumn, looking out over land that had once been failing under 9,000 starved sheep and a widower's grief, and was now whole and thriving under 12,000 head and a family 3 generations deep, said only, "No, I don't suppose it is," and turned, at last, with the light going long and gold and quiet across the ridges, to walk back down toward the house that had, in the end, in every way that mattered, become entirely her own. There was a particular evening in late September of 1878, some weeks before the note crisis came fully to a head, that Addie would remember for the rest of her life as the true turning point of her marriage, though nothing dramatic occurred in it at all, only a long, quiet conversation at the kitchen table that let Thomas Calloway see, for the first time without reservation, the whole shape of what his wife actually carried inside her. He had asked, that night, almost shyly, for a man of his gruff habits, whether she would show him her father's old sample books, the ones she kept in the trunk, and had never once, in 5 months, brought out for anyone's inspection. Addie fetched them without a word, laid the 11 volumes out across the table in the lamplight, and walked him through them one by one. This page a Rambouillet cross-graded, fine enough to rival the best Vermont stock. This note in her father's hand about a buyer in Boston who had tried, in 1869, to underpay a whole county's clip by claiming a false standard of comparison. This final entry, in her own younger hand, recording the last healthy season her father's operation had seen before Aldous Fenn's fraud came to light and swallowed the whole of it. Thomas turned the pages slowly, asking questions that revealed, as much as anything Addie could have said aloud, how starved his own operation had been for exactly this kind of careful, accumulated knowledge. Questions about crimp and staple and yield that showed a rancher's son's native curiosity finally given something worth chewing on. My grandfather kept some of this in his head, Thomas admitted, turning a page showing a particularly fine merino cross, but he never wrote a lick of it down that I ever found, and when he died it went into the ground with him same as everything else a man doesn't trouble to record. You've got 20 years of your father's whole education sitting right here in ink, and I'd wager there isn't another operation between here and Cheyenne that's got anything half so thorough. There isn't, Addie said, with a plainness that was not boastful so much as simply factual, the same tone she used for a column of figures that added up correctly. That's why I brought them. I didn't know, packing that trunk, whether anyone out here would ever want what was in it. I only knew I wasn't going to leave it behind for a man like Aldous Fenn to have the last word on what my father, what our family, actually understood about wool. Thomas closed the book gently, the way a man closes something he has come, in the space of an evening, to understand is more valuable than he had first reckoned, and said, I want you keeping these in the front room, Addie, not folded up in a trunk in your bedroom like something to be ashamed of. And I want the flock register built off whatever's useful in them, starting this fall, before the next lambing season, if you're willing to teach the whole of it to me and Ezra both. It was, Addie thought later, the moment the marriage stopped being an arrangement and started, however slowly, becoming something closer to a partnership neither of them had quite dared name yet. The daily rhythms of that first full year deepened through the autumn and into the second winter with a texture Addie found herself, in later years, recalling more fondly than the dramatic crises that punctuated it. There was the particular gray-gold light of a Wyoming October morning, frost silvering the sage before the sun burned it back, and the sound of the flock moving down off the high pasture ahead of the season's first real cold, a sound like a low, continuous murmur of bells and hooves and complaining ewes that Addie had learned, by her second autumn, to find as comforting as any hymn. There was the smell of the kitchen on baking day, sourdough and the last of the season's apples going into a pie Daniel liked to help crimp at the edges, his small fingers clumsy and earnest at the crust. There was Thomas's habit, developed sometime that second autumn and never afterward abandoned, of bringing Addie a single wildflower or a particularly fine bit of quartz he'd found out on the range, not as a grand gesture, but as a small, unspoken report of the day, a habit Addie treasured more than she ever quite told him, because it said, without saying, that he had thought of her while he was out working alone under that enormous sky. There was also, that second winter, a hard stretch in January when a blizzard closed the ranch off from the hollow for the better part of 2 weeks, and Addie found herself managing not only the house and the ledgers, but, for 4 of those days, the whole daily operation of the flock's winter feeding, when Thomas came down with a chest fever bad enough to keep him bedridden. She and Ezra Coates worked the feed lines together in cold so severe it stung the eyes to blink, hauling hay by sledge to stock too weak to range far for forage, and it was in that stretch, watching her work 16-hour days without complaint and without once suggesting the flock's needs might wait on a man's health to recover, that Ezra finally set aside the last of his early doubt about her. "Told you back in the summer you had your father's eye for a fleece," he said, on the 4th day, both of them stamping feeling back into numb feet by the barn stove. "Didn't say then you'd have his stomach for hard work too, but I'll own it now. Never seen a Rutland wool factor's daughter shovel a feed sledge before, and I'll tell you plain, most ranch wives I've known wouldn't have lasted a single one of these 4 days without taking to their bed with the vapors." "I haven't got time for the vapors, Ezra," Addie said through chattering teeth. "Not with 4,000 head depending on this feed line, and a sick husband depending on me not catching whatever he's got." And Ezra laughed, a genuine surprised laugh, and said only, "No, I don't suppose you have," and the easy respect in that exchange settled something between them that no amount of wool-grading demonstration alone could quite have accomplished. Thomas recovered by the week's end, weak but improving, and found on his first day back on his feet that the flock had been fed without loss through the worst of the storm, the ledgers kept current despite the crisis, and his wife asleep sitting upright in a kitchen chair, having stayed awake past exhaustion the final night, to be certain his fever had truly broken before she allowed herself to rest. He carried her to bed himself, gently, and sat beside her a long while watching her sleep, and told her, the next morning, over coffee she was almost too tired to properly taste, "I don't know as I ever properly understood, before that storm, what kind of woman the agency actually sent me. I sent for a wife to card wool, Addie. I got a partner who kept this whole operation alive while I lay useless in bed, and I mean to spend the rest of whatever years we've got making sure you never once doubt that I know the difference between the two." That same winter brought a smaller, quieter callback to the very beginning of the story, one Addie noticed and treasured, without remarking on it aloud. Thomas, mending a bit of harness by the fire one evening, looked up and asked her, almost idly, "You ever regret bringing that whole trunk of books? That first day, not knowing whether I'd want anything to do with them?" Addie thought of the mud, the mule with its clouded eye, the flat question that had been his only greeting, "Can you card wool?" and said, "Never once. I'll tell you the truth, Thomas. I almost left them in Rutland, packing that trunk. Told myself a woman going west to card wool for a stranger didn't need a factor's whole education weighing down her one trunk. I'm glad, now, that some stubborn part of me packed them anyway. I don't know as I'd have found a way to be useful here otherwise, beyond exactly what you first asked of me." "I asked for considerably less than what I got," Thomas said, setting the mended harness aside. "And I've never once been sorry for the difference." And outside the window, the same Wyoming stars that had watched her arrive as a stranger 8 months before wheeled on, indifferent and eternal, over a house that had, by slow and deliberate degrees, become a home built as much on her own hidden competence as on his hard-won land. The autumn of 1884 brought a trial of an entirely different character, one that tested not the ranch's finances but its patience, when a fever swept through the flock itself, a foot rot that spread faster than any remedy Hetty Vance's usual doctoring could touch, threatening to undo in a single wet season what 6 years of careful breeding had built. It was Addie's own reading, this time not of ledgers but of her father's old notes on flock sanitation, copied from a Vermont agricultural pamphlet decades before and tucked into the back pages of one of her sample books, that gave them their answer: a copper sulfate footbath, rigorously applied twice weekly across the whole flock, combined with a strict quarantine of the worst affected animals into a separate pasture until the rot cleared. Thomas was skeptical at first, the remedy unfamiliar to anything the ranch had tried before. But Addie's plain insistence, "I've read 3 cases in my father's notes where exactly this method cleared a flock inside 6 weeks, and I've read considerably more where doing nothing lost a rancher half his stock by spring," carried the day. And the footbaths, dug and filled and driven through twice weekly by every hand on the ranch, including, in the muddiest weeks, Addie herself with her skirts pinned up out of the muck, brought the flock through by the first hard frost, with losses far lighter than the district's other affected ranches suffered that same season. Cyrus Dunmore, whose own flock lost nearly a fifth of its number to the same outbreak before he finally, grudgingly, adopted Addie's footbath method 3 weeks too late to save the worst of his losses, cited that autumn for years afterward as the moment he stopped merely tolerating Addie Calloway's competence and started actively seeking it out. The winter of 1886 into 1887, the same terrible season that would come to be remembered across the whole territory as the Big Die-Up, the worst winter cattlemen and sheepmen alike had ever recorded, tested Widow's Fork more severely than any single crisis since the note itself. And it was here, in the depth of that historic cold, that the flock register and breeding discipline Addie had built over 8 patient years proved their fullest worth. Ranches across the territory lost 60, 70, in the very worst cases 80% of their stock to a cold that held unbroken from November, clear through April, and Cyrus Dunmore's own operation, still recovering from the foot rot losses 2 winters before, lost better than half its flock before the thaw finally came. Widow's Fork, by contrast, lost just under 15%, a devastating number by any ordinary measure, mourned deeply by every hand on the place, but a fraction of the district's average, owed directly to the careful winter feeding schedules and the hardier, more resilient cross-breeding Addie's register had guided since 1878. "You built this flock to survive a winter like this one before either of us had any notion such a winter was coming," Thomas told her, in the raw, grieving relief of the year's first thaw, walking the pasture together counting what remained. "I don't know as I ever properly thanked you for that particular foresight, Addie, seeing as it wasn't foresight exactly, more your father's whole hard-won education finally paying out its interest, same as that note once did, only paying it out in living animals instead of dollars. It's the same arithmetic either way," Addie said, looking out over a flock diminished but fundamentally intact, "whether you're counting dollars or counting sheep. Tend the true figures carefully enough, long enough, and they hold when the weather finally comes to test them. That's all breeding discipline, or bookkeeping either one ever really is." It was in the aftermath of that terrible winter, watching neighboring ranches struggle to rebuild flocks gutted by losses Widow's Fork had been spared, that the Reeve Calloway Hall found its true, lasting purpose beyond the modest kitchen table gatherings of its earliest years. Ranchers who had once dismissed Addie's careful breeding records as an Eastern woman's fussiness came, in the difficult seasons following the die-up, asking directly for copies of her flock register methods, for guidance on rebuilding stock along hardier lines, for the plain financial counsel that would let them rebuild without falling prey to the kind of predatory lending that had so nearly cost Thomas the ranch a decade before. The Hall's membership, which had numbered perhaps a dozen women in its first winter of operation, grew past 60 families by 1890, drawing not only wives now but sons and husbands too, chastened by a winter that had taught the whole territory, in the hardest possible terms, that careless management and careless arithmetic alike could cost a family everything it had built. Margaret Louise's own wedding, in the spring of 1899, to the young schoolteacher Amos Kirby, who had come to the Hollow 2 years before to run its newly built proper schoolhouse, gave Addie occasion to reflect, standing in the same small church where she and Thomas had married 2 decades before, on how entirely the ground beneath her daughter's feet differed from the ground she herself had first stood on in the mud of 1878. Margaret Louisa came to her own marriage not as a stranger sent west to prove her worth to a man who barely knew her, but as a young woman already established, respected, and financially literate in her own right, her position at the Hall secure regardless of what her marriage might or might not become, her choice of husband made freely rather than arranged by any agency's practical calculation. "I want you to know," Margaret Louisa told her mother, the morning of the wedding, both of them dressing in the same small room, "that I chose Amos because I love him, not because I need him to keep me. The way I understand your own arrangement with Papa started out rather differently. I don't know as I'd have had the freedom to make that distinction, Mama, if you hadn't spent 20 years teaching half this county's women that a wife's worth doesn't depend on a husband's charity." Addie, fastening the last button of her daughter's wedding dress, found herself unexpectedly moved past speech for a long moment and said finally, "That's the whole of what I hoped for, Margaret, more than the hall or the flock or any of the rest of it. I hoped you'd never have to learn the hard way what I learned standing in the mud that first April, wondering if what I knew would ever matter to anyone. I'm glad you never had to wonder it at all." Daniel's own children, Josiah and Hetty, grew up through the first decade of the new century, absorbing the whole accumulated history of Widow's Fork as simply the ordinary shape of the world rather than any hard-won achievement, a fact that struck Addie, watching them, as perhaps the truest measure of how completely the ranch's fortunes had turned since that first desperate spring. Josiah, quiet and studious like his great-grandfather Josiah Reeve, whose name he carried, took naturally to the flock register's careful record-keeping from the time he was old enough to hold a pencil steady, while young Hetty, named for the healer who had done so much to see the family through its hardest years, showed an early gift for doctoring that the elder Hetty Vance, well into her 70s by then, but still sharp as a tack, took particular delight in nurturing, teaching the girl to set a simple fracture and brew a fever tea with the same patient thoroughness she had once brought to teaching Addie herself the plain lesson that a person's worth in this country was measured by usefulness demonstrated rather than reputation inherited. The winter of 1907 brought Addie's final significant expansion of the Hall's mission, a decision she made at the age of 51 with the same deliberate, unhurried clarity that had characterized every major choice of her adult life. A scholarship fund, seeded from the ranch's own steadily accumulating wool profits, to send promising young women from ranch families, regardless of whether their own fathers or husbands saw the value in it, to proper agricultural or normal schools in Cheyenne or Denver, the way Daniel had once gone to Fort Collins, an opportunity that had, until then, existed almost exclusively for sons. The first recipient, a quiet, sharp-eyed girl named Constance Ruiz, daughter of the same Tobias Ruiz, who had once trained under Ezra Coates's exacting eye, went on to become the district's first female licensed veterinarian within a decade, a fact the Hollow Sentinel reported with evident local pride under a headline that made explicit mention, as most of the paper's coverage of the Hall's activities did by then, of the fund's origin in Addie Calloway's own long-ago arrival with nothing but a trunk of borrowed knowledge and a stubborn refusal to let that knowledge go to waste. In her final years, Addie took to keeping a small private journal, separate from the ranch's official ledgers, in which she recorded not figures but reflections, a habit she had never permitted herself in the anxious early years when every spare hour had gone to defending the ranch's finances or building the Hall's earliest classes, but which she allowed herself, at last, once the whole structure she had built no longer required her constant vigilance to stand. One entry, written in the autumn of 1910, not long before her final illness began its slow course, read in its entirety, "I have thought a great deal this year about what my father would make of all this, could he see it. The Hall bearing his name alongside my husband's, his own sample book sitting under glass where half the district's daughters now come to learn what he taught me at a kitchen table in Rutland 30 years before anyone west of the Mississippi had ever heard the name Reeve. I do not think he would recognize the scale of what grew from what he gave me. I do not think he ever imagined, in his own last gray months, that the thing he'd taught his daughter might outlive the ruin of his own name by this much, or repay itself this many times over, in ledgers and fleece, and daughters taught to read a compounding schedule without shame. I only know that I have spent 30 years making certain his teaching was not wasted, the way the county so nearly wasted his good name, and I believe, on the balance of the whole account, that the debt between us is at last, entirely, paid in full. The last spring of Addie's life, in 1912, brought the flock's shearing season once more, the same rhythm that had first cracked open the distance between her and Thomas 34 years before, in a shearing shed doorway neither of them had known, at the time, would matter to the whole shape of their lives together. She insisted, against Daniel's gentle protest, that she ought to rest, rather than stand for hours in a working shed, on attending the first day's shearing one final time, and stood at the edge of the floor, watching Tobias Ruiz's own son, now running the clip tables with the same careful eye Ezra Coates had once trained into his father, calling out staple lengths and fineness grades in a voice that carried, unmistakably, the cadence of instruction that had passed from Addie's own father, through her, through Ezra, through 2 full generations of hands who had never once met Josiah Reeve, but carried forward, without knowing it, the whole of what he had once taught a girl at a Rutland kitchen table. She reached out, standing there, and picked up a raw fleece from the sorting table, ran it once between her fingers the way she had that first April morning in the shed doorway, feeling for the coarse Kemp fiber that had once announced her whole hidden competence to a roomful of startled men, and found, as she had known she would find, that this year's clip, bred and tended across 4 decades of careful record-keeping, held none of it at all, only fine, even, honest wool, exactly as fine as anything her father had ever graded in his own best years in Rutland County, before the world had decided, so briefly and so wrongly, that a Reeves name and a Reeves knowledge of wool were worth nothing at all. She died 6 weeks later, in the spring light of a Wyoming May, with Thomas's grave visible from her bedroom window on the rise above the north pasture, with 3 generations of her own family gathered in the house, and with the lamp in the Reeve Calloway Hall's front window, a half-mile off across the grass, lit as it was every evening, regardless of who came or went from the world, burning steady in the dusk, the way it had burned every evening for 27 years, and would go on burning, Daniel promised her in her last lucid hour, for as many years after as the county had women willing to walk through its door, and men wise enough, at last, to let them. The last image the family kept of her, spoken of for years afterward at the Hall's Tuesday gatherings the way a scripture verse gets spoken of in a congregation that has long since made it their own, was of her final morning, when she asked to be helped to the window rather than left lying flat, and sat a long while looking out past the rise where Thomas lay, past the shorn flock grazing steady and fine-fleeced in the near pasture, past the low dark shape of the hall with its lamp not yet lit for the evening but its windows catching, even in daylight, the same gold Wyoming light that had first fallen across a stranger standing in the mud 34 years before, with a trunk of borrowed knowledge and nowhere yet to put it down. She did not speak, in that final hour, of scandal or vindication, or of Pruitt or Marsh, or any of the old grievances, long since settled, and long since forgiven or left unforgiven, as each case had warranted. She spoke only, once, quietly, to Daniel, of the land itself, the particular blue-gray-green of sage after rain, the sound sheep bells make carried on a west wind, the way good wool feels between a careful hand's fingers when a whole life's patient breeding has finally bred the coarseness clean out of it. And then she was quiet, and the light moved on across the ridges the way it always had and always would, indifferent to any single life it had ever warmed, and the flock grazed on below the window, fine-fleeced and numerous and utterly untroubled, exactly as she had spent 34 unhurried years teaching the whole of Widow's Fork, sheep and ledgers and daughters alike, to be. Widow's Fork endured long past that quiet May morning, passed down through Daniel's line and Margaret Louise's in turn. The flock register kept faithfully in the same careful hand its founder had first taught. The hall's lamp lit every Tuesday evening for decades more, and the name Reeve Calloway carried, eventually, onto letterhead and ledgers and a bronze plaque set into the hall's own cornerstone, reading simply, "Founded by a woman who was sent to Cardwell and brought." Instead, everything she knew. The sage still silvered with frost each October morning on that same stretch of Wyoming ground, the sheep bells still carried on the same west wind, and the light, each evening, still moved gold and unhurried across the ridges above Widow's Fork, exactly as it always had, long before any Reeve or Calloway had ever stood beneath it, and long, one supposes, long after the last of either name is spoken there again.